Okay, so Tucker Carlson interviewed Vladimir Putin. Now, this interview was conducted on February 6th. It came out yesterday on X, and I realized it was a 2 hour and 7 minute interview, and I knew that there was some way to condense it down for people who didn't want to sit there for 2 hours. And so that's the purpose of this. I'm going to go down and break down, summarize everything that was talked about in the Carlson Putin interview. And to give you an idea of how dense this interview was, it took me about 4 hours just to get through the first hour and a half. And then the last half hour or so, there was a lot that was repeated. They went off in the weeds a little bit. But like Tucker says, as a precursor to this interview, Putin seemed very sincere, whether you agree with what he says or not. Putin believes that Russia has a historic claim to parts of Ukraine. So view what he says as a sincere expression of that, of what he thinks. And so a little side note here, because getting into this, I've done videos on Ukraine and Russia before, and people in the comments would correct me and say it's pronounced Kyiv, not Kiev. And so the pronunciation of the capital of Ukraine is actually a dividing line. Ukrainians pronounce it Kyiv, or somewhat similar to Kyiv, while Russians would say Kiev. So while I'm going through this, because it's from Putin's point of view, I'm going to say Kiev, but just know that that distinction exists. So the first question that Tucker Carlson brought up was on February 22nd, 2022. He said that Putin addressed his country in a nationwide address where he said he believed that the US, through NATO, might initiate a surprise attack on Russia. And so his question there was really gearing towards, why Putin invaded Ukraine and what the whole deal with that was. And so Putin goes all the way back in through Russian history, and it's a useful dive, really. And even as Tucker Carlson says at the beginning, he thought it was kind of like Putin trying to filibuster, but then he realized it's not. Like, Putin was not filibustering. He was giving what he believed to be relevant historical information. So Putin starts with going all the way back to when the Russian state was established in 862 AD. He said, and he said a lot about this. It basically amounted to the Russian state going through periods of unification and then fragmentation. But after a strengthened Russian state really took shape, including the southern part that included Kiev, and those southern lands began to gravitate away from Moscow and toward the European center. And so what was a Russian culture with Russian community, Russian faith, that started to gravitate toward the European center. And then Lithuania began aligning with Poland, eventually forming a Polish-Lithuanian state. And the Polish-Lithuanian state tried to instill the idea that they were not Russian, but rather because they lived on the fringe, they were Ukrainian. So originally, Ukrainian meant the person was living on the outskirts of the state. This was back in the 13th century. And so they wrote to Warsaw in Poland, demanding that their rights be upheld, but after being refused, they wrote letters to Moscow in Russia, asking them to be accepted under the rule of the Moscow Tsar. And again, these are the people living on the fringe in Russia. They weren't immediately accepted, as Russia was anticipating war with Poland, and eventually war broke out. The war lasted 13 years, and in 1654, a truce was concluded. And roughly 32 years after that, a peace treaty with Poland was signed, and the whole left bank, including Kiev, went to Russia, while the right bank went to Poland. So this all lasted until the Russian Revolution in 1917. Tasting World War I on the horizon, Austrian generals began propagating this idea of Ukrainianization, that Poles were not really Russian, and the motive was basically to weaken the potential enemy to the Austrians, the Russians. So Poles believed that they were not Russian, but rather Ukrainian. And the Bolsheviks sought to restore Ukrainian statehood. Now, the Bolsheviks, in the Russian Revolution, there were the two sides, the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And the Bolsheviks sought to restore Ukrainian statehood, and the civil war began. A treaty was signed in 1921 that divided the left and right bank up just as before, as it did in the late 1600s. And in 1939, at the start of World War II, Poland cooperated with the Germans despite not yielding to their demands, and they partook in the partitioning of Czechoslovakia. And again, I'm summarizing a lot here that Putin went very in depth on, and so it can seem a little bit jumpy, but really he's going fairly chronological through history here. So then he's at the start of World War II. He's talking about how, of course, World War II started when Germany invaded Poland in 1939. But he was saying that Poland cooperated with the Germans despite not yielding to their demands, because Poland helped Germany partition Czechoslovakia. And really, Poland did a lot of that. Like that was largely Polish people and Ukrainian people. Now, World War II started because Poland was uncompromising with the Germans over a land dispute. So they had nothing to do really but go to war. When Poland was partitioning Czechoslovakia, they gave back the western part to Ukraine, the western part of Ukraine to Russia. And so this was, again, Poland partitioning Czechoslovakia. They gave the western part of Ukraine back to Russia. So while the USSR received the satellite states like Ukraine, Lithuania, etc., Poland received their own West back that had originally been German. So Eastern Germany became Western Poland. And I promise this all has a point. Like, again, Putin genuinely believes that the area that is Ukraine, or at least a portion of that, is genuinely Russian territory, historically speaking. So now in 1922, the USSR established the Soviet Ukraine, which had never existed before. Stalin wanted these additional states to be autonomous entities, but Lenin wanted them to be able to withdraw from the USSR if they wanted. And Putin was a little bit confused as to why Lenin would have wanted this, but regardless, that's what Lenin wanted. So Lenin transferred to the newly established Soviet Republic of Ukraine some lands that had never been called Ukraine. But the Soviet Republic of Ukraine was still considered to be part of the USSR. So what you see now is the Soviet Republic of Ukraine now gaining more land that they did not originally have, even though the entire Soviet Republic of Ukraine was still considered part of the USSR, the Russian motherland. Now, the Soviet Union was given a great deal of land that never belonged to them prior to this point in time, including the Black Sea region. So Russia received the Black Sea region largely as the outcome of the Russo-Turkish wars. So Bolsheviks began to push Ukrainianization because of the policy of indigenization. And so indigenization is the process of bringing something under control, dominance, or influence of the people native to the area. And so the Bolsheviks started to push this Ukrainianization in the hopes of bringing this under the control of the people of the native area. So in all of this, because again, it really gets pretty in depth, Putin basically just concludes that Ukraine is an artificial state shaped by Stalin's will. There aren't like definite boundaries that make any sense historically other than just Stalin going, this is the area that is Ukraine. And again, that's the Putin's perspective on Russian history. So Tucker keeps bringing up that Putin, because he's been the president of Russia now, this is his 24th year, Tucker keeps bringing up that Putin never made this case in 22 years as president of Russia. And it wasn't until just 2 years ago that he brought any of this up. So Putin continued to go back to the historical explanation. He said in 1991, the USSR collapsed. Everything Russia had given Ukraine was dragged away. More than 90% of the population of Ukraine spoke Russian. They had a common culture, common history, common faith with interconnected economies. And so US leadership assumed that the former USSR ceased to exist. And so this was something 1991, USSR is dissolved, and the US leadership and really the Western world as a whole thought that it was like they were just done. Like there was nothing else going on there. So there were no more ideological dividing lines. They thought that that was completely dissolved. So Russia encouraged, this is according to Putin, Russia encouraged and initiated the collapse of the USSR, and assuming that it would be understood by the West as an invitation for cooperation and association. Basically, he saw that the US, or his perception of this is that the USSR was seen as being very divided against the United States. And through the dissolution of the USSR, they were able to now come to a point where there could be cooperation and association, mutual benefit between the nations. So Tucker says that Putin has said the reason that Russia and the US can't cooperate is because the West fears a strong Russia. But Tucker points out that our government doesn't seem to be fearing a strong China too much. And while I would say that we're not fearing a strong China nearly enough, there's a lot more that goes into that. And so anyway, Putin says that the West fears China more than Russia because Russia has 150 million people, but China has 1.5 billion. And also China's economy is growing rapidly. Putin went very in depth on that, on how the Chinese economy is expanding rapidly. The Chinese yuan is growing in popularity globally. And the promise after 1991 was that NATO would not expand eastward toward Russia, but it happened 5 times. So then he talks about Boris Yeltsin, who was the Russian president prior to Putin. Boris Yeltsin, Russian president from 1991 to 1999, expressed support of this fact that NATO would not expand eastward. So what did the US do in retaliation to this? Well, in violation of international law and the UN Charter, it started bombing Belgrade. So Tucker asked why Putin thought the West wouldn't have wanted Russia to join NATO in the early 2000s. Because this was a topic that they talked about quite a bit. You know, Tucker said, like, well, if they asked you to join NATO, would you have? Because Putin was talking about a meeting that he had with Bill Clinton, and he asked Bill Clinton, if Russia wanted to join NATO, do you think that they would let them in? And Bill Clinton at first said, I think it was something along the lines of like he could see it happening, but then he talked to some of his top guys, and they were like, no, we wouldn't let Russia in. And so they were talking about NATO for quite a while and Russia joining NATO, all of this. So Tucker, again, he asked Putin why the West wouldn't have wanted Russia to join NATO in the early 2000s. So Putin talked about how they tried to build relations with the West in the Middle East in a soft and prudent manner because they had seen this type of very explicit desire to affiliate and cooperate with one another at the dissolution of the USSR, and it failed. The West didn't want that. And so now when they were approaching this kind of new path to potentially affiliating and cooperating, they had a more soft and prudent approach to it. And this was in the Middle East. So Putin repeatedly said the US should not support separatism or terrorism in the North Caucasus, but they continued to do it anyway. The US continued to provide support to terrorist groups. So Russia reached out to the CIA and asked why they were doing this. And the CIA replied that they've been working with the opposition in Russia because they believe it's the right thing to do and they'll keep on doing it. No comment. I have videos on that. I mean, I don't think what the CIA does is any secret to anybody, especially anybody tuning into this channel, but anybody who who knows how to read between the lines or look beyond the media headlines. So anyway, Tucker asked for clarification if Putin was saying that the CIA was trying to overthrow the Russian government. And Putin said that they kind of meant this reply more in relation to the terrorist groups fighting against Russia in the Northern Caucasus, but he didn't really rule out whether or not he believed the CIA was actively trying to overthrow the Russian government. So the third big moment, okay, because again, the first was not allowing them to join NATO. The second was funding and supporting opposition in the Middle East. So the third big moment was when the missile defense system was being created. Putin met with Bush Sr. and proposed that the US, Russia, and Europe jointly create the missile defense system. They believe if it was created unilaterally, it would threaten Russian security. So unilaterally just means like either the US and Europe create this and Russia's left off, or the US creates it and Europe and Russia are left off, or any combination. So basically, where they don't come together in a joint resolution. They believed if it was created unilaterally, it would threaten Russian security. So the US said it was being created for missile threats from Iran. And that was more or less Putin said like that's what their facade was, oh, it's for missile threats from Iran. So then Secretary of Defense Gates, former director of the CIA, and Secretary of State Rice, Condoleezza Rice, went to Moscow and visited with Putin and said that they agreed to jointly create the missile defense system, but with some exceptions. And he didn't really get too much into the exceptions, but he was basically talking about it like they said they agreed to it, but they didn't really agree to it. So Tucker clarified that twice, Bill Clinton and Bush Sr., Putin explained US presidents agreeing to something with him and then being undercut by US agency heads. So it's not being run by the people elected, but rather appointed. And Putin said, yeah, that's right. So Putin warned them that Russia would then have to take countermeasures if they created this missile defense system unilaterally. So they'll create strike systems in Russia to then overcome the missile defense systems. This is how an arms race goes. So they created hypersonic systems with intercontinental range. So then Putin, at this point in the interview, he gets back into the 5 waves of NATO expansion that he had referenced previously. And this was NATO expansion into the Baltic states, into Eastern Europe, and so on. And now in 2008, they came to Ukraine. NATO did. At the summit in Bucharest, they declared the doors for Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO were open. So many European states were opposed, but President Bush exerted pressure on them and they had to agree. So you had European states who didn't want to open the door to Ukraine and Georgia, potentially because of what they saw it was going to do to Russia and their militarization. But President Bush at the time exerted pressure on these European nations and they had to agree. And this is not the only time that you'll see the US exert pressure on a foreign power. They said that Ukraine won't be in NATO in 2008, even though the door was still open, but they wouldn't guarantee that it would stay that way. They couldn't guarantee that Ukraine would never be allowed to join NATO. Ukraine was also supposed to be a neutral state in their founding, but suddenly the doors to NATO were open to it. Now, all the politicians who came to power in Ukraine at this time had a good attitude toward Russia. Viktor Yanukovych came to power after Kuchma, and the first election, Yanukovych won. But then they organized a third round, or like another election, which was not provided for in the Ukrainian constitution. This, according to Putin, was a coup d'etat. Yanukovych's opponents did not recognize the initial victory, and the US supported the opposition having another round of elections, and then that winner came to power, and that was Viktor Yushchenko, who was very pro-Western. Well, things got worse under Yushchenko, and Yanukovych came to power anyway. So then, and I know this is kind of jumping around a little bit, but just, this is more, I feel like this is a better video for somebody who's listening to it, because it's really putting a lot of pieces together, and I think Putin did a really good job of going in order and connecting a lot of things. And some things he made very clear, some things were not so clear. But anyway, then they came to the issue of association with the EU, the European Union. And this turned out to be a problem because of Russia's free trade zones and open borders with Ukraine. An EU association would have opened the borders to Europe and led to a flooding of the market. So Russia decided to close their customs borders with Ukraine because of this. Now, Yanukovych said he needed more time to think before signing on to the EU association. And that led to the opposition to Yanukovych taking destructive steps. This led to the coup in Ukraine. The West said, basically, this was in Putin's words, the West said, calm Yanukovych down and we'll calm down the opposition. So Russia agreed, yet the opposition still committed a coup in Kiev in 2014 with the backing of the CIA. And this is something I have a video up on the channel, Obama's snipers in Kiev, and I go very in depth on that exact topic. Now, they launched the war in Donbass in 2014, talking about the US here. The US, basically, CIA, US, they're on the global stage, they're pretty well mended together. So they launched the war in Donbass in 2014 with aircraft and artillery against civilians. Putin said that Russia could not abandon Russian people in the face of this war machine. And so you get the idea, the sense in this interview, that Putin very much looks at these people as having a singular culture, a singular community, very intertwined economies, and a singular faith. And he can't bear to see, at least it seems very genuine from Putin's perspective, he can't bear to see these people who he sees as Russian facing this kind of destitution by the West. So Germany, Poland, and France signed as guarantors of the signed agreement between the government of Yanukovych and the opposition. So basically what this means is that there was peace signed between Yanukovych and the opposition party. Germany, Poland, and France signed as guarantors of that peace agreement. But once the coup happened, they ignored it and they pretended that they didn't sign as guarantors of the peaceful agreement. Yanukovych even agreed to an early election that he had no chance of winning to try to bring peace to the region. So why the coup? Why the victims? Why threaten Crimea? Why launch an operation in Donbass? Putin says he doesn't understand it and that it was a miscalculation. The CIA did its job to complete the coup. That's what they were supposed to do. But it was a miscalculation. He says Russia would have never thought to lift a finger if everything had been done legally without the bloody developments. And I think a good piece of evidence to this is that Russia wasn't doing a whole lot when Yanukovych agreed to an early election he had no chance of winning, and everything, they had agreements drawn up, they had peace talks in the works, and then there was the coup, there were the victims, there was the threatening of Crimea, there was the war in Donbass that was launched, and it's like all of these things added up, and Putin felt like he has to do something to stop the Russian people from dying in this war machine. And so then Putin gets into what triggered the latest events. First, there was the current Ukrainian leadership that agreed it would not implement the Minsk agreements signed after the 2014 coup, and they would not implement the plan of peaceful settlement set forth in Donbass. So you can look up the Minsk agreements and peaceful settlement in Donbass if you'd like, but basically this would have brought peace to the region. This is something that would have been a cooperative agreement and affiliation between these nations. So Russia says that they talked with Western leadership in this time constantly, telling them to implement the Minsk agreements. Putin believes that if they managed to convince the residents of Donbass to return to Ukrainian statehood, the wounds would start to heal. When they reintegrated into a common social environment, when the pensions and social benefits were paid again, all the pieces would gradually fall into place. But everyone else wanted to resolve the issues by military conflict. Putin says Ukraine started the war in 2014, but Russia's goal is to stop the war. And Russia did not start the war in 2022, but it's an attempt to stop it. And I think that this is kind of similar to what we'd see, just a little quick analogy. I think this is similar to what we'd see if we were trying to stop, say, China from buying up US farmland, or stop the integration the integration really of Chinese culture and the Chinese Communist Party into American culture and taking over certain American institutions. They're doing it peacefully, but it's not really peaceful and it's not advantageous to Americans or the West. And so the way that Putin describes this is very similar to, okay, they're pushing and pushing and pushing, and you're not seeing what's happening because bombs aren't dropping. But now we're at a point where if we're going to stop this constant pushing, bombs have to start dropping. And so, really, yeah, his genuine feeling here was that Russia did not start the war in 2022, but they were attempting to stop it. And he alluded a few times to the idea that this could have gotten a lot worse if Russia did not step in and do something, because the West and NATO, the CIA, would have continued to take more and more and more. So Tucker asks Putin if he thinks that he's stopped the war now, if he's achieved his aims. And he said no, because one of the goals is denazification. And this was a very interesting part of the interview because it was not something I expected them to talk about, but it was very fascinating. Denazification. So this means the prohibition of all neo-Nazi movements. And this wasn't initiated by Russia, but rather by Europe, saying it was necessary for the final signing of these documents. Germany said Ukraine couldn't sign a treaty with a gun to their head, so Russia had to pull troops out of Kiev. So to put this simply, basically they had agreements drawn up to sign for peace, but one of the stipulations put in by Europe was for denazification in Ukraine. And Germany was concerned that Ukraine couldn't earnestly sign this peace agreement with Russian troops in Kiev, basically, like they say, holding a gun to their head. So Russia pulled troops out of Kiev, and Ukrainian negotiators then threw all the agreements into the trash and got prepared for a long armed confrontation with the help of the US and its satellites in Europe. And then they go deeper on denazification. Putin says that after Ukraine gained their independence, they began to search for their identity. They built this identity upon some false heroes who collaborated with German leadership in World War II. These German leaders and their collaborators were responsible for the massacres of Polish and Jewish people as well as Russian people. So this hits very close to home for Putin. And this was something, again, he seemed very genuine talking about. So while a lot of countries fight against the rise of neo-Nazis, Ukraine is not the same. They have monuments of these false heroes erected in Ukraine, put on flags, shouted in the streets with torches. Russia says Ukrainians are part of the one Russian people, but they say that they're separate. So Putin says that they can be separate, that's fine with him, but not on the basis of Nazism. So the Ukrainian leadership, this was an interesting little story, and Tucker in his interview actually played B-roll of this exact event. The Ukrainian leadership visited Canada. Canadian Parliament introduced a man who worked for the SS and killed Russians, Poles, and Jews. The SS troops consisted of Ukrainian nationalists who did this dirty work. The president of Ukraine stood up with the entire Canadian Parliament and applauded this man who had killed Poles, Russians, and Jews. And again, Tucker in his interview pulled up the B-roll of this. So Tucker asked Putin how he would control this dangerous ideology being spread in a country that he doesn't control. Well, Putin brought up that during the negotiations at Istanbul, we agreed neo-Nazism would not be cultivated in Ukraine, including that it would be prohibited at the legislative level. Putin says this can all be done during the negotiation process. And he says peace talks were almost finalized. But after Russia withdrew troops from Kiev, all of the agreements were thrown out, and the president of Ukraine has legislated a ban on negotiating with Russia. So he signed a decree forbidding anyone to negotiate with Russia. And so Putin's like, well, how am I supposed to negotiate if you set a ban on negotiating with us? So makes you think. So before the current situation that developed in February 2022, Putin talked to Joe Biden and told him he's making a serious mistake by pushing Russia away. Putin says that the solution to ending conflict is simple. If the US wants to end this conflict, they need to stop supplying weapons and it will all be over within a few weeks. This brought up memories to me of the video that I did that's, I believe, still up on the channel, of the leaked audio of John Kerry talking about how the Obama administration was going to disrupt the Middle East. And they said, if we pump in weapons, somebody else is going to pump in more weapons. And that's a lot what this sounds like. If the US wants to end this conflict, according to Putin, they need to stop supplying weapons and it will all be over within a few weeks. Putin says that NATO is talking about talking about this conflict becoming a global war or a nuclear conflict. And he says they're basically trying to intimidate or scare their own population with this imaginary Russia threat. So Tucker asks Putin about the expansion of Russia and expansionist policies, if Putin would desire to expand into more regions with Russia or if he has enough land. And Putin said that the only time that he would send troops, because one of the example countries brought up was Poland, Putin says the only time he would send troops to Poland is if Poland attacked Russia. He says he has no interest in Poland, Latvia, or anywhere else. Putin says unequivocally he does not have territorial aims across the continent. He has no interest in a global war. He basically says that the whole thing is a fear-mongering tactic to extort US and European tax dollars in the confrontation with Russia in the Ukrainian theater of war. The goal is to weaken Russia as much as possible. That's what they're trying to do. And soon here, Putin gets into how that's not really happening. And this isn't something like it's Russian propaganda. It's something you can see on the global stage. You can see it in global economies. It's not really working. Like the US going after Russia with sanctions and whatnot is not really all that successful. So Tucker brings up how Chuck Schumer said that we need to continue funding Ukrainian war efforts so that US troops don't end up fighting there. Putin says it's just provocation. Putin wants the US to respect Russia and Russian interests and to start looking for peaceful solutions. So Tucker asks Putin who blew up Nord Stream. So for those who don't know, Nord Stream is two natural gas pipelines between Europe and Russia. And when Nord Stream was blown up, one of them was destroyed and the other was damaged. So Putin says that it was the CIA. Tucker asks if he has any evidence of NATO or the CIA doing it. And Putin says, we'll look for someone who's interested and has the capabilities. So Tucker asks why Putin doesn't publish the evidence of this. With all his intel agencies, he's got to have evidence of this. And as we find out here soon, the Germans clearly know that their NATO partner blew up Nord Stream. So Tucker asks Putin why he doesn't publish the evidence. And Putin basically says that it wouldn't do any good. He says it's very difficult to defeat the US's propaganda because they control all of the media and much of European media. So all of the US media and much of European media. Tucker says that the Germans clearly know their NATO partner blew up Nord Stream and it damaged their economy greatly. So why wouldn't the Germans say something about it? Well, Putin says that this confuses him too, but German leadership is controlled by the interests of the collective West, not necessarily their individual national interests. He also points out how Nord Stream 1 was blown up, Nord Stream 2 was damaged, but they have a pipe straight to Europe and they won't open it. So why? There's another route through Poland called Yamal Europe, which also allows for a large flow of natural gas. But Poland closed it. Poland received funds from pan-European funds supplied by Germany. So basically, Germany feeds Poland to a certain extent, and then they close their natural gas route to Germany. Why? It doesn't seem to make any sense. Well, Germany is the second largest sponsor to Ukraine behind the US, and there are 2 gas routes through Ukraine. Ukrainians closed one route, and Putin says, please open the second route and get gas from Russia. Germany could tell Ukraine, we give you money, we give you weapons, so now open the valve and let gas pass from Russia to us, but they don't. So instead, Germany's getting more expensive gas, and they're harming their economy. Tucker pointed out that it might be beyond repair. So Putin says that security really should be shared. And when he talks about security, he's talking about affiliations between nations and cooperation and peaceful agreements. He says that security should be shared rather than saved for the golden billion. That's the only scenario where the world could be stable, sustainable, and predictable. So Tucker asks how sanctions have changed the US dollar's place in the world. Putin says that as soon as US leadership decided to use the dollar as a tool of political struggle, a blow was dealt to this American power, the US dollar. Even US allies are downsizing their US dollar reserves. The fact that the US applies restrictive measures to certain countries causes grave concern and sends a signal to the whole world. So since 2022, Russia has downsized their use of the US dollar considerably, going from 50% of, I think it was international transactions, down to 13%. He said Russia had no such intentions of this, but it was the US who banned the dollar. This kind of restriction damages the US economy and global power. Meanwhile, Russian transactions in the yuan, the Chinese yuan, went from 3% to 34%. He said oil producers have also begun accepting payment in yuan. So Tucker asks about the global domination by the Chinese economy. Putin says that it's just a boogeyman. He says China's foreign policy is not aggressive. They're always looking for compromise. And he goes on about this for a while, but his main point here, he goes really deep on some of this stuff, but his main point is that division and fear-mongering is not beneficial, but cooperation is. The US adapts to global change with force, sanctions, bombings, and he said it's just a losing game. So Putin questions why Zelensky supports neo-Nazis in Ukraine while his father fought against fascism in World War II. He said he asked him this to his face. And Putin believes Zelensky could negotiate with Putin to lead the Ukrainian and Russian people to peace. So Zelensky won his election on the promise of peace, but then he learned 2 things. It's better not to clash with neo-Nazis because they're very unpredictable and dangerous, and the US will always support those who antagonize Russia. And so that's why Zelensky aligned himself with the US very quickly. Putin says Russia has never refused negotiations with Ukraine. They were set to reach a peace agreement a year and a half ago, but Boris Johnson, the former prime minister in Great Britain, persuaded Ukraine against it. So now at this point in the interview, it started going off in the weeds a little bit. Excuse me. But it's still some very good content here. Tucker asks Putin how he reconciles being a leader of a nation with being a Christian. And Putin says that it's simple. He won't attack anyone, but when it comes to protecting yourself, your country, your homeland, your future, it's protection, not hostility or aggression. Tucker also asks about the coming AI empire, and Putin says that it's already possible through genetic engineering to make a superhuman, a specialized human being, a genetically engineered athlete, scientist, military man. And he wasn't skirting around the question. He has a point here. He talks about how the process of development needs to be formalized with certain rules. Humanity has to consider what will happen with the newest developments in genetics or AI. So Putin draws a parallel here with nuclear weapons, how one country had them, then they recognized that there was a global threat because it was an instance where only one country had them. And then all of the nuclear nations came to terms with one another. And he said it's going to be pretty similar with AI, where you have these countries who eventually will develop and formalize certain rules to deal with this. So Tucker then asks a question on Evan Gershkovich, a Wall Street Journal reporter who has been imprisoned in Russia for almost a year. So Tucker asks Putin if he would release him to be brought back to the US. Putin says that Russia has done so many gestures of goodwill and never seen anyone reciprocate in a similar manner. But he says he can see it happening if Russian special services can take reciprocal steps. They're in the process, and Putin believes an agreement can be reached. So Tucker makes the case that Evan wasn't a spy. He's a kid who's a journalist. But Putin says he got secret information in a conspiratorial manner, which qualifies as espionage. He was receiving classified, confidential information, and he did it covertly, and he was caught red-handed. Putin said, it's not like there's no evidence. It's not like it's just a guessing game. We caught him red-handed. So Putin says he wants a negotiated settlement to what's happening in Ukraine. He says that they made it. They drew up the documents for this negotiated settlement, the huge document in Istanbul, and it was initialed by the head of the Ukrainian delegation. He said that they were ready to fully sign it and the war would have been over 18 months ago. But that's when, again, former Prime Minister Boris Johnson talked them out of it, and they missed that chance. Putin said that NATO could come up with a way to withdraw from Ukraine with dignity. He knows that they want negotiations to find a way out of this conflict, but they're struggling to understand how to do it. Putin said that he can fully understand how NATO would not want to seem like they lost to Russia. So they're struggling to come up with a way where NATO can preserve their dignity and also preserve peace. Putin says this is basically a civil war, but the Russian people will be reunited. And so that concluded the interview. I do want to add two things again that coincidentally were already up on this channel, and it's Obama supplying the KIEV snipers in 2014 in the coup d'etat. And then it was the leaked audio of John Kerry talking about how they destabilized the Middle East by pumping in weapons so somebody else pumps in more weapons. And that's a very similar instance here to what Putin is addressing in Ukraine. Talking about how if the US wants peace in the region, just stop pumping in weapons. Just stop. So this was the interview between Tucker Carlson and Putin. I went a little bit longer than I thought I would, but I appreciate you guys tuning in. I hope that this was helpful. Again, the interview is up on X or Twitter, and it's on Tucker Carlson's Twitter. It's like 2 hours and 7 minutes, but I hope that I was able to break things down here in a way that goes point by point, and you can understand it a little bit better. So thank you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And I'll see you back here at some point. Have a good one.